Ethan Carter, a 32-year-old billionaire, had everything a man could dream of: money, power, and luxury. Yet, one thing was missing: true love. Despite his success, he struggled to find a woman who genuinely loved him for who he was, not just for his wealth. Every woman he met seemed more interested in his bank account than in him as a person. His mother, Eleanor Carter, watched with concern. She had built their family empire alongside her late husband and knew the dangers of wealth when it came to relationships. Eleanor wanted her son to find a wife who truly cared for him, not one blinded by his fortune. One evening, as she sipped tea in their grand mansion, an idea struck her. If every woman sees him as a billionaire first, how will he ever find someone who loves him for himself, she thought. That's when she decided she would disguise herself as a simple cleaner in Ethan's company. This way, she could observe the women around him and find out who was genuine. Eleanor shared her plan with her loyal butler, James. At first, he was skeptical. "Madam, pretending to be a cleaner? In your own son's company?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, James," she said firmly. "This is the only way to see who truly cares for him. If I stay in the background, I can watch and listen without anyone knowing who I really am." With determination, she had a fake identity created: Eleanor Smith, an elderly woman looking for a cleaning job. The next morning, she arrived at Carter Enterprises, dressed in a simple uniform. The billionaire's mother was ready to uncover the truth. Eleanor stepped into Carter Enterprises, her son's massive corporate empire, dressed in a plain blue cleaner's uniform. Her usual elegant dresses and expensive jewelry were gone. Instead, she wore a simple apron and a cap to cover her well-styled hair. To complete her disguise, she even wore old shoes and slightly smudged glasses. No one would recognize her as the mother of one of the wealthiest men in the country. As she walked through the grand lobby, she felt something she hadn't in years: anonymity. For the first time in decades, she wasn't being treated as a billionaire's mother. She was just another worker, unnoticed and invisible. The hiring manager, an exhausted-looking man named Mr. Green, barely glanced at her resume. "Cleaning experience?" he asked. "Yes, many years," Eleanor replied with a humble smile. "Fine. You'll start immediately," he said, handing her a mop and a cleaning cart. As she pushed the cart through the gleaming hallways, she kept an eye out for the women in the office. Were they kind? Rude? Genuinely hardworking? She needed to observe everything. Then, she spotted her son. Ethan walked past her, speaking with his assistant, unaware that his own mother was disguised as a cleaner nearby. Eleanor's heart swelled with love and pride. He was handsome, confident, and respected. But was there anyone in this office who saw him beyond his wealth? As she dusted a nearby table, she overheard a group of young women whispering, "He's so rich. Imagine marrying him." One giggled. "Ugh, I wish. That would be a dream come true," another sighed. Eleanor frowned. Was anyone here truly sincere? She had to dig deeper. As Eleanor continued her work, she paid close attention to how people treated her. Most employees ignored her, some even looked down on her. It was a harsh reminder of how the wealthy often overlook those in lower positions. But Eleanor wasn't here to complain, she was here to observe. Then, something unexpected happened. While scrubbing the floor near the cafeteria, Eleanor accidentally spilled a bucket of water. The cold liquid splashed onto her shoes, and the mop slipped from her hands. "Oh no," she muttered, trying to clean up quickly before anyone noticed. Just then, a young woman rushed over. "Are you okay?" she asked, kneeling to help. Eleanor looked up and saw a kind face. The woman had warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. Unlike the others, she wasn't laughing or walking away. Instead, she grabbed some napkins and started wiping up the water. "Thank you, dear," Eleanor said, pretending to be flustered. "No problem. Accidents happen," the woman replied. "Let me get a dry cloth." A few moments later, she returned with a fresh cloth and handed it to Eleanor. "What's your name, dear?" Eleanor asked, curious about this kind stranger. "Sophia." "I work in the finance department," the woman said. "Are you new here?" "Yes, first day," Eleanor answered carefully. Well, if you need help with anything, let me know, Sophia said with a warm smile before heading back to her desk. Eleanor watched her go, intrigued. Unlike the other women she had observed, Sophia didn't seem interested in wealth or status. She simply cared. Interesting, Eleanor murmured to herself. Perhaps she had found someone worth watching. Over the next few days, Eleanor kept a close eye on Sophia. Unlike the other women in the office, Sophia never spoke about Ethan's wealth. His confidence from earlier had completely vanished. The class held its breath, waiting for his response. A few students leaned forward, eager to witness what would happen next. One of the other professors, Dr. Hamilton, finally stood up. Adjusting his glasses, he walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders was cleared. He traced his finger along the equations, mumbling under his breath. Derivative, correct. Limits applied properly. No sign error. A minute passed. Then another. The longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became. She was right. A murmur spread through the students. Some exchanged shocked glances, others whispered in excitement. The girl they tried to humiliate had just outperformed the experts. Whitaker's jaw tightened. You must have seen this problem before, he snapped. There's no way a student, especially a first year, solves this that quickly. A ripple of discomfort spread among the faculty. That's when she did something that left everyone speechless. She walked to the second board, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and said, "Give me any problem. Right now." The room froze. Professor Caldwell's eyebrows lifted in surprise, while Hamilton actually looked impressed. But Whitaker? He was furious. "I don't have time for games," he said sharply. She smiled. "Then maybe you should stop playing them." The class erupted. Whitaker's face burned red. He had underestimated her. And now? Everyone knew it. The energy in the room was electric. Students whispered among themselves, some barely containing their excitement. Never before had they seen a student challenge a professor so boldly, especially not one like Professor Whitaker. Dr. Hamilton smirked and crossed his arms. "Well, Professor Whitaker," he said, amused. "She's given you an opportunity. Are you going to take it, or are you going to back down?" A flicker of frustration crossed Whitaker's face. His reputation was on the line now. He couldn't just dismiss her without looking weak. He turned to the board and scribbled a new problem, a multivariable calculus equation so complex that some students gasped just looking at it. "There," he said smugly, stepping back. "Solve that." She didn't hesitate. She picked up the chalk and immediately got to work, her movements swift and confident. Every stroke on the board was precise. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. She was in her element. Whitaker expected her to struggle, to show signs of doubt. Instead, she moved through the problem faster than he thought possible. 5 minutes later, she dropped the chalk. Done. Silence. Dr. Hamilton walked up again, adjusting his glasses. He examined her solution, checking line by line. Then, he chuckled. "She's right." The class exploded in whispers and gasps. Whitaker's fists clenched. "Impossible." But Hamilton turned to him, a slow smile on his face. "Looks like your student just outperformed you, Professor." Mr. Whitman turned to Margaret, his forehead glistening with sweat. Ms. Ellis, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. If I had known you were coming. Margaret held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Whitman. You shouldn't have to know I'm coming for your staff to treat me, or anyone else, with respect. Olivia's knees wobbled. Ms. Ellis, I swear, we didn't know who you were, she blurted out, her voice desperate. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. And what if I wasn't the owner? Would my treatment have been acceptable then? Stephanie stammered, and no, of course not. We were just following store policies. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Store policies? She glanced at Mr. Whitman. Does this store have a policy that says elderly black women can't browse without being treated like criminals? Mr. Whitman paled further. Absolutely not, Ms. Ellis. Our employees are trained to do exactly what they just did. Margaret finished for him, her voice calm but cutting. Olivia and Stephanie had no words left. They stood there, eyes darting between each other, silently pleading for a way out of this mess. Margaret sighed, setting down the expensive necklace she had been eyeing. You see, I came here today not just to shop, but to experience firsthand how customers are treated in my store. And I must say, I'm incredibly disappointed. She turned back to Mr. Whitman. I want a full review of how employees are trained. Effective immediately. Mr. Whitman nodded rapidly. Of course, Ms. Ellis. Whatever you say. Margaret's gaze shifted back to the two women. And as for you two, we'll have to discuss whether you deserve a place in my company. Olivia and Stephanie's faces turned ghostly white. Margaret glanced at her watch. I'll expect a full report by tomorrow morning, Mr. Whitman. She turned to leave, her dignity and power firmly intact. And as she walked away, every employee in the store knew one thing for certain: things were about to change. Margaret strode toward the store's exit, but the heavy silence behind her made her pause. The employees stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and realization. Customers, who had been silent witnesses, began murmuring among themselves. Some recorded on their phones, while others shook their heads at the shameful display they had just witnessed. Mr. Whitman rushed forward, his hands slightly trembling. Ms. Ellis, please. Let's not be hasty. Olivia and Stephanie have been with us for years. Perhaps a warning. Margaret turned slowly, her expression unreadable. A warning? Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Stephanie, sensing an opening, clasped her hands together. Yes, Ms. Ellis. We've been loyal employees. We work hard. Margaret folded her arms. Tell me something, Stephanie. When I walked into this store, what did you see? Stephanie hesitated. I saw someone who didn't look like our usual customers. Margaret nodded, her gaze unwavering. And because of that, you assumed I didn't belong. Olivia swallowed hard. It was a mistake, Ms. Ellis. We didn't mean to humiliate me? Margaret finished for her. Didn't mean to treat me as if I were less than the wealthy customers you roll out the red carpet for? Both women had no response. Margaret sighed. This is bigger than just me. How many others have walked in here and been treated the same way? How many customers have you pushed away because of your bias? Mr. Whitman wiped his forehead. I assure you, Ms. Ellis, we will implement better training. Margaret raised a hand to silence him. Training? You think a seminar will fix years of ingrained prejudice? She turned back to Olivia and Stephanie. You don't just need training. You need to understand what real customer service looks like. She pointed to a well-dressed black man in the store. Sir, may I ask, have you ever been treated unfairly in this store? The man hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. I've felt unwelcome here before. Margaret's jaw tightened. That's what I thought. She looked back at Mr. Whitman. Affected immediately, Olivia and Stephanie will be reassigned to the stockroom. Their eyes widened. The stockroom? Olivia gasped. Margaret's expression was firm. If they want to stay with this company, they'll have to learn what it means to work behind the scenes. No more front-end customer interactions until they can prove they deserve it. The weight of her words settled over the room. Margaret took a deep breath and glanced around the store. Things will change. Starting today. And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a store that would never be the same again. Margaret stepped out of the store, but the impact of what had just happened was far from over. Unbeknownst to her, several customers had recorded the entire confrontation, capturing the moment she revealed her ownership and the employees' stunned reactions. Within hours, the videos began spreading across social media. Old black lady gets humiliated in a luxury store, then shocks everyone. The caption alone drew thousands of views in minutes. The comments section exploded. Imagine treating someone like that and then finding out they own the place. Karma at its finest. Ms. Ellis is a queen. This is why you treat everyone with respect. She handled it with such class. I'd have fired them on the spot. By the next morning, Margaret's assistant, Lisa, was frantically calling her. Margaret, have you seen the internet today? Lisa's voice was filled with excitement and urgency. Margaret, who had just finished her morning tea, raised an eyebrow. No, why? Check your phone. You've gone viral. Everyone is talking about you. Margaret picked up her phone and clicked on one of the links Lisa had sent. Officer Walker pulled me over for no reason, she continued, and when I revealed who I was, he attempted to cover up his mistake. This is what happens when people in positions of power feel untouchable. But it's time we show them that no one is above the law. The room erupted into murmurs. Some faces were skeptical, others were nodding in agreement. But the colonel wasn't done. I've seen it all in my years of service. I've fought on the front lines, served my country, and led men and women into battle. But I've also seen the flaws in the system. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. We cannot afford to ignore these issues any longer. This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about ensuring that everyone, no matter their race, their gender, or their background, receives the same respect, the same protection, and the same justice. The reporters were on edge now, cameras aimed at her. The colonel leaned forward. I will not stop until I see real change. Until every person in this country is treated equally, with the respect they deserve. Officer Walker may have tried to intimidate me, but I'm not going anywhere. The room was silent once again, the power of her words hanging in the air. This was no longer just about a traffic stop. This was about a movement, a call for justice that couldn't be ignored. The colonel turned to leave, but not before leaving them with one final thought: this fight has only just begun. The press conference had sent shockwaves through the country. News outlets were running with the story non-stop. People were taking sides, but the majority rallied behind the colonel. Her words resonated with so many, a call for justice, accountability, and change. The pressure on the local police department intensified. Officer Walker's actions were now the subject of national scrutiny. Internal Affairs had no choice but to accelerate their investigation, and the district attorney was already reviewing potential charges. Walker had been placed on indefinite leave, but that was no longer enough to keep the public from demanding action. Back at the colonel's home, her phone rang constantly, but this time it was different. The calls weren't just from journalists or supporters. There were also threats, anonymous messages warning her to back down, to let it go. She knew the risks. People in power didn't like being exposed. But she had already made her decision. She wasn't backing down, and neither was she going to let this moment fade into the background. But then, she received a call she hadn't expected. "Colonel, it's me," her contact from Internal Affairs said. "We've got some serious updates." She took a deep breath. "What's the situation?" "The investigation has moved faster than we anticipated. We've uncovered not just Walker's actions, but a pattern of misconduct in his past. This goes deeper than anyone thought." Her heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" "It means Walker's career is over. He'll face criminal charges for what he's done, and we're building a case for a broader reform effort within the department." She couldn't help but let out a quiet breath of relief. "This is good news." "Yes," he replied. "But it doesn't stop here. We're looking at a systemic issue, Colonel. And if you want to continue pushing for real reform, you'll have to be ready for what's coming." The colonel nodded, determination flooding her veins. "I'm ready." The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. She would not stop until true justice was served, and no amount of pressure, threats, or intimidation would change that. As the investigation into Officer Walker deepened, it wasn't just his actions under the microscope anymore. It was the entire department. The colonel had ignited a fire, one that was now threatening to consume everything in its path. Internal Affairs had uncovered troubling patterns of racial profiling and excessive force within the department, all tied to Walker's past. His colleagues, some of whom had been complicit in the cover-ups, were now facing their own scrutiny. Walker wasn't alone in his misconduct. He was part of a larger, darker system. The media was all over it. News anchors, political commentators, and activists were calling for sweeping police reform. The pressure on local officials was mounting, and the colonel knew that this was the moment to push harder, but the higher-ups weren't happy. Some whispered that the colonel had gone too far. Too public. Too loud. The balance of power had shifted, and it was unsettling for those who had always been in control. The phone call came on a quiet evening. Her contact from Internal Affairs spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Colonel, there are People, powerful people, trying to bury this. They're going to try to discredit you. The colonel's hand tightened around the phone. What do you mean? They're pulling strings. Political figures. Some in law enforcement. They're using their influence to get ahead of this. She clenched her jaw. What's the plan? They want to turn the focus back on you. They'll try to paint you as someone who's using your position to attack the department. They'll try to make you the villain. The colonel was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the threat. Let them try. The truth is on my side. I'm not going anywhere. She wasn't naive enough to think there wouldn't be fallout, but she had already come this far. She had the public's support. She had the media's attention. And most importantly, she had the truth, but she also knew the deeper, darker truth: there would be powerful people trying to stop her. And as the battle escalated, it was becoming clear that the stakes were higher than ever. She had to be ready. The colonel had never been one to back down from a fight, but this was different. As the investigation into Officer Walker continued, the pressure from the highest levels of power escalated. The forces working to bury the truth were vast, and they were determined to shut down the momentum she had sparked. But now, the colonel wasn't just fighting for herself, or even for Officer Walker's victims. She was fighting for something much bigger. The entire system was being tested, and there was no turning back. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted in cities across the country, calling for justice and reform in law enforcement. The colonel's speech at the press conference had become a rallying cry, and the story of the racist cop who had picked the wrong target had become a symbol for something far greater than a single incident. But with every victory, the attacks against her became sharper. Her enemies weren't just trying to discredit her, they were trying to destroy her. One evening, she received an anonymous email. The contents were chilling. We know where you live. A thinly veiled threat. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Fear nodded her, but it was quickly replaced by something else: resolve. She had faced danger before, in far worse situations. And she wasn't going to let intimidation stop her now. The following day, the investigation hit a tipping point. The department had been forced to release the full details of Walker's past, including accusations of racial bias, use of excessive force, and multiple complaints from citizens that had been ignored. The case was now in the hands of the district attorney, and Walker was facing not only termination but criminal charges for his actions. The colonel was receiving calls from all directions: government officials, civil rights groups, even foreign diplomats, all acknowledging her courage and pushing for national reforms. But through it all, one thought remained at the forefront of her mind: this wasn't just about Walker anymore. This was about systemic change. She stood in front of the mirror that evening, looking at herself. This was the fight of her life. And she wouldn't stop until justice had been served on, and no matter what came next, the battle isn't over. The story of one officer's abuse of power has become the catalyst for change, but the fight for justice, accountability, and equality in law enforcement continues. This is where you come in. Join the movement. Stand up for what's right, speak out against injustice, and be the voice for those who have been silenced for too long. Together, we can dismantle the systems that allow abuse to thrive and replace them with one where justice, respect, and fairness prevail for all. Support reforms, demand transparency, and never stop fighting for change. Your voice matters. The colonel's story is just one of many. Let's ensure it's not the last. Take action now. Let the world know that we will not tolerate injustice, and we will not stop until equality is a reality for every person, in every community, across this country. To be the change you want to see. Stand with us. Stand for justice.